Hello, and welcome to the Geopolitics Explained podcast. Today, we're going to conclude the series on Greenland. I'm going to discuss potential scenarios that could unfold for Greenland in the future in relation to the United States' ambitions towards the territory. But before we discuss the future, I want to look towards the past. A few weeks ago, over on Substack, I wrote a post about the history of Greenland, Denmark, and the United States and how they intertwine. I never released this as a podcast episode, and so before we explore the future, I'm going to set the groundworks by discussing the history surrounding these three geopolitical actors. So, Greenland was settled by Norse colonies over 1,000 years ago. These colonies disappeared, and the Inuit societies that remain today continued independently. Denmark and Norway united crowns in 1380, and Greenland was inherited as a dependent territory of both, despite the absence of Norse settlements at the time. In 1721, Hans Egede, a missionary, sailed to Greenland intending to reassert Danish and Norwegian sovereignty over the territory. It was this period that marked the continuous European administration over the territory that remains today. But it was after the breakup of Denmark and Norway after the Napoleonic Wars that Greenland remained solely with Denmark, as per the Treaty of Kiel from 1814. It was after the Treaty of Kiel and after the Napoleonic Wars that the United States started to grow interested in Greenland. This occurred around the same time that the United States was undertaking many other territorial acquisitions. The United States has purchased many territories in the past. So much so that around 40% of its total territory today has been purchased. In 1803, the Louisiana Purchase was the acquisition of the territory in the Mississippi River's drainage basin to the west of the river. In return, the United States gave the French First Republic $15 million. However, at the time, France only controlled a portion of this territory. The United States effectively bought the legal right to govern the territory of the indigenous populations, which led to widespread displacement, conflict, and suffering for these communities. Of other purchases that the United States made for territory, we also saw them gain Florida from Spain as a part of the Adams-Onis Treaty in 1819. In return for this deal, the United States renounced its claims to Texas. But after this, we had the eventual annexation of Texas due to the Mexican-American War, and the United States also gained California, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Wyoming as a part of this conflict. One of the most well-known purchases that the United States made was the purchase of Alaska from the Russian Empire for a sum of $7.2 million in 1867. After this, we saw Hawaii, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines follow. But despite all of these territorial purchases, the most interesting one in relation to our discussion today is the United States purchasing the Virgin Islands in 1917. This is the most interesting because the United States purchased the Virgin Islands from Denmark. The US Virgin Islands, as they are known today, were previously called the Danish West Indies. With the United States' purchase, the aim was the pursuit of Mahan's sea power theory. Controlling the coal stations and naval bases in the early 1900s ensured global navigation, and global navigation of the seas translated into global power. The islands sit at a choke point in Caribbean shipping lanes, which includes access to the Panama Canal. The fear of the United States was that Germany could seize the islands if it occupied Denmark during World War I. This was despite the Danes' neutrality during World War I. As a result of this, the United States made this deal in 1917. Notably, as a part of the treaty that backs this deal between the United States and Denmark, the US made clear that they wouldn't challenge Denmark's claims in Greenland. This was important at the time because Greenland was open to competing claims. The major differences between the Virgin Islands back then and Greenland today is that Denmark lacked the capacity to defend the islands. The islands were unprofitable, and selling them avoided the risk of them losing them without compensation in the aftermath of World War I. Today, Greenland needs economic subsidies from Denmark, especially for access to necessities such as food and fuel, but Greenland is defended by NATO. So today, we find ourselves in an environment where the United States is still clearly interested in Greenland. To set the stage for today, what previous attempts have we seen the United States undertake in its attempts to acquire Greenland? Discussions in 1867 started in the US were advocated by the Secretary of State at the time, William H. Seward. More discussions surrounding Greenland occurred in 1910, but it was after the post-1917 treaty that the United States' interest in Greenland started to accelerate. After the 1917 treaty, we saw Norway claim parts of eastern Greenland. In 1933, the case was ruled in Denmark's favour at the Permanent Court of International Justice. As a result, Greenland belonged to Denmark in its entirety. But there was a blip for Denmark during World War II because Denmark was occupied by Nazi Germany. Under previous defence agreements, this led the United States to enter Greenland in the absence of the Danish. After World War II, in 1946, the United States secretly offered to buy Greenland, which was rejected by Denmark. The United States remained there after the end of World War II. By 1948, the Danish stopped asking the United States to leave. A year later, in 1949, Greenland was officially under the protection of NATO, but the United States continued to seek to acquire Greenland for itself. It was in the 1951 US-Denmark Agreement on the Defence of Greenland that the United States' military presence in Greenland was formalised. This included the establishment of multiple military bases without the United States having to pay rent or taxation on these bases. As a part of this treaty, the United States once again stated that they wouldn't challenge Danish sovereignty over Greenland, and they officially recognised that Greenland was Danish territory. Yet, the United States still sought greater control in Greenland. In 1955, the Joint Chiefs of Staff still proposed further acquisition attempts. Since then, the most notable chapters in this history have been the acquisition attempts of Donald Trump during his first presidency, and then today during his second presidency. For years, analysts have been discussing the Arctic as an upcoming region of geopolitical rivalry, be it for shipping lanes, resources, or for bragging rights. It's clear that the importance of the Arctic is rising, and today, this importance is clearer than ever. So, that covers the history that I wanted to explore. Now, let's look towards the future. In Donald Trump's most recent acquisition attempts towards Greenland, there were three strategies that were proposed publicly by the United States. These strategies were a purchase, which would be a cooperative bargaining game, where the United States' legitimacy would be somewhat preserved, but in the event of a purchase, leverage over Denmark and Greenland would be limited, because Denmark and Greenland have stated that they do not want to sell. Even if a price was found, in the event of a purchase, this process would be slow, and the costs imposed on the United States would be moderate, mostly in a financial sense. The next strategy that was proposed publicly was a potential invasion. This would be a quicker strategy, but the likelihood of this strategy occurring would depend on the willingness of the United States to take a massive reputational hit. Initially, Trump refused to rule out an invasion, before then backpedaling on this statement. An invasion would be a fast strategy, but it would have massive negative ramifications, many of which would likely affect the United States itself. The final proposed strategy of the three was a strategy of persuasion. This would be a repeated signalling game from the United States. They would likely rely on economic or security incentives to shift attitudes over time. This was seen with Donald Trump's proposal to offer Greenlanders financial incentives to join the United States. This would be the slowest strategy, but the costs would be the lowest. If we zoom out and analyse these three strategies on a surface level, they differ in three conditions. The first condition is the severity of the strategy. The second is the speed of the strategy. And the final difference is the cost of the strategy. In an optimal scenario for the United States in seeking to acquire Greenland, they would want a strategy that was low severity, fast speed, and low cost. Of the three strategies discussed, none of them fulfill all three of these categories at the same time. A purchase is lower severity, but it is slow and has a moderate cost. Invasion is fast, but it is high severity and has a high cost. And persuasion is low cost and low severity, but it is very slow. Based on this surface level analysis, persuasion would seem like the best strategy because it is low cost and low severity. So that is 2 out of the 3 conditions. The other strategies of purchase and invasion only possess 1 out of the 3 admirable conditions. However, despite persuasion on paper seeming like it would be the best strategy, we've been discussing in recent weeks how Trump has been playing zero-sum games. His strategy, as a part of these pursuits, is to make rapid moves before anybody realises what has actually occurred. We saw this with Venezuela, with many of us waking up to the news that the US operation had occurred overnight, and as a result of this, there was nothing that anybody could do because it was already over. Because of the power asymmetry that the United States has over other nations, Trump clearly doesn't have the patience for slow strategies, and instead he is seeking to coerce and pressure other nations into giving him what he wants. This, in my opinion, is why Greenland could escalate once again. If we look at the other 2 strategies outside of persuasion, which is a purchase and an invasion, both of these strategies would be escalatory. Now, these were the scenarios that were presented publicly. If we put our scenario analysis hats on, other scenarios could exist outside of these 3. With this in mind, what alternative strategies could we see arise in the future in regard to Greenland? Before diving into the potential scenarios, we know what the United States wants and we know what Donald Trump wants in regard to Greenland. He wants quick, rapid-fire wins to improve his options, and he isn't afraid to pressure any nation in this pursuit. But we have to consider what Greenland wants because this plays a vital role in how any US action against Greenland would be perceived. During the period where tensions were at the highest, Greenlanders were protesting in number, rejecting control from the United States. The Prime Minister also rejected a US takeover by any method, stating, quote, "We choose Denmark." It was clear that Greenland was pushing back, and so any move that the United States makes against Greenland is likely to be deemed as escalatory. Now, I need to state, in exploring potential scenarios, there is one scenario in which we see no escalation, and this chapter is over. However, for the sake of this discussion, let's assume that escalation will occur in the future, to which I've implied, due to Trump's zero-sum game theory strategy, I believe will happen in reality. With this being said, what aspects will play a key role in the potential for future rising tensions surrounding Greenland? The first scenario that I'd like to discuss is the United States expanding its military presence in Greenland. Under the agreements made in 1951, that was amended in 2004, the United States can have as many troops as it wants in Greenland, but it has to consult Denmark and Greenland first. I question why the United States didn't do this in the first place. Danish officials have stated that they recognise the threat that Russia and China pose in the Arctic, and so surely this would lead Greenland to want to align with the United States on a win-win basis. But instead, Trump's zero-sum way of thinking saw him opt for a more aggressive strategy. The Greenland framework that was proposed will likely resemble a further amendment to the 1951 Defence of Greenland Agreement, and more details of this will likely emerge in coming months. The issue in this scenario, with an expanded US military presence in Greenland, would be what would occur in the aftermath of this. Would this be an innocent move, or would Trump and the United States have ulterior motives? The next scenario that I want to discuss is a scenario where the United States could pursue business deals for rare earths in Greenland. I've also alluded to this in previous discussions, that this is a scenario where all sides would be incentivized to pursue cooperation. The United States could enter into win-win relationships with Denmark and Greenland, offering investment and development of rare earths in return for an expanded military presence. The United States instead chose to sacrifice relations with Europe and to pursue tit-for-tat economic, trade and financial warfare. On paper, cooperation here seemed like an easier way to gain access to rare earths. Of course, this would be a long-term pursuit, but surely building from a base of cooperation rather than aggression would stand the United States in greater stead for long-term success. I've also alluded to in my discussion on Brazil for 2026 that I believe that there are easier areas for the United States to invest and expand in its rare earth diversification than Greenland. I discussed this in the Brazil episode because Brazil has large reserves of underdeveloped rare earths. This could be an opportunity for the United States to invest and to diversify away from Chinese rare earth control. This would start win-win relationships of cooperation rather than zero-sum strategies that ultimately hinders the United States because in the long term, nations are losing trust. I believe that these are two strategies that are the most likely to unfold in the future in regard to the United States' acquisition in Greenland. I'll now move on to some more aggressive strategies that we could see unfold. Could the United States attempt to squeeze Greenland? We did see the United States blockade Venezuela. Due to Greenland's reliance on food and fuel imports, could we see a similar playbook unfold here? Would this then, in return, incite NATO defence against the United States on Greenland? This would truly be an unpredictable, chaotic scenario, that would very easily slip into negative sum territory. For the United States, it has enough options to pressure the Europeans, as I'll discuss in next episode, but the valuable resources and effort that the United States would use in such a geopolitical tussle would very clearly benefit geopolitical adversaries such as China, who weren't involved. For this reason, I don't see rapid escalation such as this occurring, because the United States, in all of its current pursuits, remains focused on China. I am more inclined to expect slow pressure strategies if we do see escalation again, such as the next strategy. This is a strategy or a scenario where Trump would once again pursue tariffs in an attempt to pressure the Europeans. In a scenario of renewed tariff pressure, I could see this escalating quickly, since Europe has seemingly had enough of Trump's tariff pressure strategies. I say this because the Europeans threatened to utilise its anti-coercion instrument. Now, the instrument that the Europeans possess acts better as a deterrent, and in reality, implementing this tool would hurt Europe more than it would likely hurt the United States. Because we've seen Trump enact tariffs so many times, during the remainder of his presidency, I do expect that we will be here once again with more tariffs being directed towards other nations. The question is whether Trump will pursue tariffs in relation to the Greenland issue. A final scenario I want to discuss is a scenario where Europe potentially pulls back. A few days ago, JD Vance stated in an interview that Europe is cooperating in more ways than has been publicly discussed when it comes to Greenland. If this is true, the situation surrounding Greenland could already be over. Alternatively, we could see some geopolitical theatre emerge in a few months, just as we did with the previous de-escalation after the 12-day war between Iran and Israel. This theatre could give the United States what it wants, with cooperation being revealed between Europe and the United States that isn't currently public. However, I don't see how Europe would be incentivized to make such heavy concessions, especially based on how hard they stood their ground in support of Denmark and Greenland against the United States. But still, since JD Vance made this statement and since this is currently hidden information, we will have to wait and see in regard to this scenario, but it is one to keep in the back of our minds. As I stated earlier, of all the above scenarios, the pursuit of business deals and an expanded military presence are the two scenarios that I believe are the most probable. But the potential for this situation to already be over, due to information that hasn't yet been made public, is also a scenario worth considering. To conclude this series on Greenland, there is a notable change in this issue in relation to other pursuits that the United States is currently undertaking. The issue is that the United States, in targeting Greenland, is targeting an ally rather than a geopolitical adversary. Ultimately, this massively changes the future direction that we head in. The United States, in the last few months, has already made enough moves that are placing every single nation on the planet on high alert. If the United States makes these same aggressive moves against an ally, this will truly mark the end of the United States' support from many other middle powers around the world, most notably the Europeans. Initially, it might seem that such a move and such a decoupling would have little impact on the United States itself. After all, the United States does have much more power than these nations. But the ways in which such a pursuit would hurt the United States wouldn't be immediately visible. its credibility would be ruined, trust would be shattered, and the global system would remain in a period of instability as nations pursued diversification away from the United States. Of course, such trends would unfold over decades, but any aggressive moves will accelerate this transition of diversification. So if Trump attempts to fire quick shots against allies, ultimately, he is shooting himself in the foot. I believe this is especially true when it comes to Europe, which for decades has been a strong ally. When it comes to Europe, the continent is very clearly set for a period of difficulty. Looking forward, if we enter into an environment of declining relations between the Europeans and the United States, the outcome for Europe will depend on how much pain they are willing to endure and if they can successfully diversify away from the United States. If this pain is too much, would this see Europe come back to the United States with its tail between its legs? In such a scenario, this would not be good for the Europeans. On the flip side, if Europe can navigate this period of struggle, it will emerge more self-sufficient and stronger. This is, of course, easier said than done, but this is better than the European Union being subject to more coercion at the hands of Trump and the United States. This is an example of short-term pain eventually being worth the long-term gain. It's this that I'll discuss in more detail in next episode. That's all for today. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a review on the podcast platform of your choice. I've been Dylan, and I'll talk to you next time.